Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 36, Episode 10, The Battle of Chaeronea. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. The Battle of Chaeronea was fought in early August 338 BC between the forces of Macedon commanded by King Philip II and his 18-year-old son Alexander, not yet the Great, against an unlikely alliance of the forces of Athens and Thebes and other allies. It was, without doubt, one of the most decisive battles ever fought in the ancient world. It decided the fate of Greece to come under Macedonian domination or remain free. The fate of Greece rested on two of her hitherto greatest military powers, Athens and Thebes. The other great hoplite power, Sparta, had been humbled by Thebes 25 years earlier. The result of Chaeronea was, however, to be a crushing victory for Macedonia, which kept all of Greece compliant to Macedonian will for the next 15 years. This in turn allowed Alexander to embark on his unprecedented conquest of the Persian Empire in 334 BC, and truly earn the epithet the Great. The history of the ancient world, and subsequent history, would have been very different had the result of the Battle of Chaeronea been an Athenian and Theban victory. The details of the Battle of Chaeronea, as much as we can recover them, deserve to be much better known. For such an important battle, we frustratingly do not have much surviving source material on it. Our best sources for the period are lost, and we are left with only summaries and anecdotes. Moreover, the historians of Alexander, of which there are many, tend to rush over Chaeronea because of the greatness Alexander achieved subsequent to it. The biographer Plutarch, for instance, has only a single sentence on Alexander's role at Chaeronea. But all that was to come for Alexander began at Chaeronea. He learnt all he needed to of warfare at this battle. Even though he was only 18, he commanded the cavalry and one wing of the Macedonian army. He was already a veteran, however. He had fought in and commanded his first military campaign at the age of only 16, and had even saved his father's life at 17. Philip had probably never expected to become the king of Macedon. He had two older brothers, Alexander II and Perdiccas III, who were both kings before him. Moreover, Philip seems to have been traded as a hostage to guarantee peace with Macedon's many enemies who dominated her when he was young, first to the Illyrians and then to the Thebans. As a hostage, he would, however, learn and observe the warfare of the greatest threats to Macedon and conceive of a way of defeating them. At the courts of the Illyrian king Bardilis, Philip probably observed the cavalry and combined armed tactics of the Illyrians, including the use of cavalry and light armed troops. In the Thebes of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, whose revolutionary reforms of warfare came to dominate hoplite warfare, he lightly observed the deepening of the hoplite line and the lengthening of the spear. These changes Philip embraced and brought into effect as soon as he unexpectedly became king, with an eye to defeating both styles of warfare. When his second brother Perdiccas III was killed in battle with the Illyrians in 359 BC, Philip left Thebes, perhaps escaping, and became king. According to the historian Diodorus of Sicily, as soon as he became king, Philip immediately set about reforming the Macedonian army. He brought together the Macedonians in a series of assemblies, equipping and organizing them. He then held constant maneuvers of his new invention, the Macedonian phalanx. This infantry formation saw 6 divisions called taxis, each of 1,500 men, and each drawn from a different region of Macedon, some 9,000 men in total. These would be drawn up 16 ranks deep and armed with a long spear, the sarissa. These were between 4.5 and 7.3 meters in length, perhaps on average 5.5 meters long. In contrast, older hoplite spears, called dori, were only 2.5 meters long, though they have been getting longer, perhaps to around 4 meters. In addition to the length of the sarissa and line depth, the Macedonian phalanx could achieve remarkable flexibility where files and subunits of the phalanx could act independently. It had a dense close order called synospismos, where each man occupied only 45 centimeters of space. This was half the space of a usual hoplite unit, where each man occupied 90 centimeters. As such, this new formation had more penetrative power and brought more spear points to bear on a single location in the enemy line. The challenge was that the phalanx was not as wide as other formations. The usual hoplite line depth was between 8 and 12 ranks, although it had been getting deeper. The Thebans regularly adopted a depth of 25 ranks, maybe more. As such, the flanks of the phalanx needed protecting. This was usually done by placing other infantry or cavalry units on the flanks of the phalanx. If its flanks were effectively protected, however, the phalanx would come to dominate the battlefields of the eastern Mediterranean and into Persia for the next 150 years. In addition to the phalanx, Philip combined it with Macedonian cavalry, allied cavalry, and light-armed troops, either mercenaries or those from allied kingdoms. This army was designed to defeat initially the cavalry armies of the Illyrians who threatened Macedon from the north, and the hoplite armies who threatened her from the south. Chaeronea would be the new army's greatest success. Alexander would take it and conquer most of the known world, and a new enemy in the polyglot armies of the Persian Empire. But those accomplishments were in the future, in 334 BC. The first test of Philip's new phalanx was at the Battle of Methone, near the modern village of Nea Agathopolis in Pieria, in 359 or 358 BC, where he faced a rival claimant to the Macedonian throne named Argaeus, who was supported by Athens. Details are slight, but it was a complete victory, though not recognized by the defeated. Athens would remain a threat until defeated at Chaeronea, and she would come up with no specific method to defeat the phalanx. Philip then went on to defeat enemies in Paeonia, Illyria, and Thrace, pressing south and taking up a more and more dominant position in Greek politics. In 356 BC, Philip took command in the Third Sacred War and used a religious pretext as leader of the Amphictyonic League, which controlled Delphi, to expand his influence further. This was also the year in which Alexander was born to the fourth wife of the polygamous Philip, Olympias. Philip continued to expand his influence and occasionally war against rebellious conquered territories. By the time Alexander was 16, Philip had expanded Macedonian influence as far as the Dardanelles and the site of modern Istanbul. But some cities in Greece still resisted, most notably Thebes and Athens. They had been implacable enemies to each other at times throughout the 4th century BC, most recently fighting at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, where Spartan power was completely broken. And there was no time when Sparta turned its attention from there to us. They saw each other as rivals rather than allies, and it was only the threat of Philip which united them. This was an unexpected and last-minute alliance, which proved to be an unmitigated disaster for both cities. By 338 BC, Philip had secured his northern and eastern ambitions and turned his attentions southwards once more, intent on the subjugation of all of Greece. This was not unexpected, but, as so often in the relations between Greek cities, they had devolved into petty squabbling rather than uniting to face an expected assault or devising a method to defeat this new threat. Athens agreed to an alliance with Thebes in Boeotia to oppose the Macedonian threat, an unexpected turn. There was a party in Athens which remained vehemently anti-Theban. Most of our sources concentrate on the contribution of Athens and Thebes and do not mention any other allied cities, though some sources mention Euboeans, Achaeans, Corinthians, Leucadians and Corcyraeans. Others just mention allies who would play little part in the battle, so their omission is perhaps understandable. This tells us, however, that there was an alliance of a large number of Greek states against the common threat of Macedon. The allies agreed to block Philip's advance southwards at Chaeronea, in the valley of the Cephissus River, and in Boeotian territory. Philip advanced south and met the allied army blocking his path. There are many unknowns in the battle. The precise site of the battlefield is still a controversy. What we do seem to know from literary sources does not marry with the site usually identified. This is complicated because we have two funerary mounds, the Lion of Chaeronea, to the dead members of the Theban sacred band to the southeast of the town, and even further east, a tumulus to the Macedonian dead. Most scholars have used these two monuments to cite the battlefield. However, it is clear that the bodies of the dead were moved to these two monument sites after the battle. The Thebans arranged their dead in neat rows, and the Macedonians gathered and cremated theirs. The literary accounts, especially a valuable anecdote in Polyaenus of Macedon, tell that Philip withdrew his army at the start of the battle up a hill. There is no hill where he could have done this on a battle site placed to the east of the town. However, there is a hill which suits such a manoeuvre, to the west of the town, Mount Thurion. This, therefore, seems to be a more logical place to site the battle, for reasons which will become clear. For the Battle of Chaeronea, we lack the detailed deployment found in the subsequent battles of Alexander in sources such as Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, and even in Diodorus himself. We can use those later deployments to our advantage, however, as Macedonian deployments remained remarkably similar. Having learnt many lessons evident at Chaeronea, Alexander would likely not deviate from what had happened there, especially when his subsequent battles brought him so much success. The usual Macedonian deployment had the centre of the Macedonian line occupied by the 6 taxes of the phalanx, each with 1,500 men, 9,000 men in total. Each was commanded by an experienced commander, usually an aristocrat from the same region in which the men had been recruited. To the right of the phalanx came the Hypaspists, a double-strength taxis, 3,000 men strong. We are not given the name Hypaspists at Chaeronea, but Philip was on the right of the phalanx with a picked group of bodyguards. This unit is probably the same as that which became the Hypaspists, although it may have had slightly fewer men. In Alexander's later battles, the companion cavalry was stationed on the right of the Hypaspis, led by Alexander himself. At Chaeronea, however, Alexander was stationed to the left of the phalanx, but did have the cavalry there with him. They are not called the companions at Chaeronea, but there is every reason to think Alexander had them with him. Other Macedonian allies, infantry and cavalry, especially the Thessalians, were also stationed on the left, as in Alexander's subsequent battles too. We are only told that Philip had 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, and that the armies deployed at dawn with Philip on one wing and Alexander the other. Nonetheless, we can use the later deployments of Alexander's battles to detail what was likely at Chaeronea. The men of the later phalanx and hypaspists would account for almost 12,000 of the 30,000 infantry. In terms of cavalry, Alexander later had 8 squadrons or elae of 200 to 300 men, 1,600 men in total. Similar or slightly smaller numbers may have been deployed at Chaeronea. In his invasion of Illyria in 359 or 358 BC, Philip had no less than 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. The subsequent successes of Philip must have seen an expansion of these numbers. The additional cavalry, up to 2,000, may have been made up of Thessalians. On the Athenian and Theban or Boeotian side, we must also use what we know of these armies from elsewhere, as we are given little to no detail for Chaeronea. We are only told that more than 1,000 Athenians fell and 2,000 were captured. We are not given a specific number for the Boeotians, only that their casualties were similar. Diodorus only includes Athenians and Thebans, or Boeotians, at the battle opposing the Macedonians, and only hints at the presence of other allies. The Athenian orator Demosthenes, however, gives us a list of allies he had gathered: Euboeans, Achaeans, Corinthians, Thebans, Megarians, Leucadians, and Corcyraeans. These allies provided 15,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. The geographer Strabo also mentions the Corinthians as allies. We might suggest that the other allies provided these numbers, but the Athenians and Thebans or Boeotians provided more men, perhaps 7,500 infantry and 1,000 cavalry each. This would bring their army up to the size of the Macedonians and make the losses to Athens and Thebes approximately 40% of their total numbers. On the Macedonian side, Philip commanded one wing and Alexander the other. Philip the right, Alexander the left. This matches later battles and implies that half of the phalanx was included in the right wing and the other half in the left. Opposing them, the Athenians faced Philip, and the Thebans were next to them. The allies were drawn up in echelon, each division slightly behind that to their left. This allowed the Thebans to concentrate their power in one spot, typically on the left, where they had won their greatest victories. It also meant they could concentrate their attacks on the enemy commander, usually positioned on the enemy right, precisely where Philip was. This approach allowed fighting a battle with the best troops while keeping less reliable troops out of the fight. Since the other allies seem not to have become involved in the fighting at Chaeronea, this suggests an echelon battle order, possibly a concession to Athens to allow them on the extreme left of the battle line. The Thebans may have allowed the Athenians this position of honour because they provided the most men, or to allow Athens to be the leader of the alliance. We are not definitively given the names of the commanders of the Athenian and Theban or Boeotian armies. We know Theagenes commanded the Sacred Band and was presumably the overall commander of the Theban forces. On the Athenian side, there were usually several generals, up to 10, called strategoi. Only 3 are named: Lysicles, Stratocles, and Chares. Lysicles was later blamed for the defeat and put to death, while Stratocles and Chares fled for their lives. The historian Justin tells us that the Athenians outnumbered the Macedonians opposite them, the men with Philip. If the Athenians had 7,500 men, this would outnumber Philip's half of the phalanx, and might suggest either that he had less than 3,000 bodyguards, or that the Athenians had more men. The greater line depth of the Macedonians would also mean they had a much narrower frontage than the men opposing them. The battle began soon after dawn, with the Athenians charging the Macedonians opposite them. Here is where the detail of the battle seems to really let us down. But all is not lost. According to Polyaenus of Macedon, after drawing up his line, Philip yielded and gave way to the Athenian charge, withdrawing towards some high ground to his rear while keeping his phalanx together in close order. Their shields protected them from Athenian attacks. After withdrawing up the high ground, Philip halted his men, then turned them to attack and routed the Athenians, who had thought they were winning. Philip is credited with the observation, "The Athenians do not understand how to win." This anecdote is usually ignored in accounts of the battle, since it does not fit with ideas about the site of the battle. Another anecdote tells us that Philip knew the Athenians were passionate, but in poor physical condition and inexperienced, in contrast to his own men. He deliberately prolonged the contest, making the Athenians easier to defeat. This idea is repeated in other sources. Many of our sources concentrate solely on the conduct of Alexander at the battle, because he would become Alexander the Great. These can be used alongside the oft-ignored anecdotes to gain a reasonable picture of the battle. According to Diodorus, Alexander faced the Thebans. The battle was hotly contested for a long time, and many fell on both sides. Then Alexander charged his cavalry at the enemy formation and was the first to break through the line. Gaps opened up in the Theban front line, and only then did Philip advance. Cavalry did not usually charge undisrupted heavy infantry formations, but it seems the Theban line was disrupted. The gaps caused by the Athenians advancing and the Thebans struggling to stay in formation allowed Alexander to charge with his cavalry into those gaps. This may have signalled Philip to halt his withdrawal and countercharge downhill towards the Athenians, catching them by surprise and ensuring their defeat. The other allies, seeing this, then fled from the battlefield without engaging further. In all of Alexander's subsequent battles against the Persians, especially the Granicus, the Issus, and Gaugamela, he enacted battlefield strategies to create gaps in the enemy line and exploit them with his cavalry. It is reasonable to accept that he did the same at Chaeronea. In his later battles, Alexander always charged his cavalry with infantry in support, suggesting he did so at Chaeronea as well. When Alexander broke through the enemy line, the Thebans soon followed, and the remainder of the allied army fled. The actions of Philip are portrayed as competing with Alexander for the glory of the victory, but it seems clear that both combined in a deliberate plan to defeat the Athenians and Thebans. The elite unit of the Theban army, the Sacred Band, played a special part in the history of the battle. Consisting of 300 elite hoplites equipped and housed at state expense, they died fighting, one man per each, facing Alexander. Philip is said to have wept at such a loss of brave men. The lion was later erected over them as a funerary monument. When excavated in the late 19th century, it revealed 254 skeletons. The bodies were moved into that position, laid out in 7 neat rows, as were the Macedonian dead at the tumulus raised over them. The placement of the lion and tumulus probably played no part in the topography of the battle, but have been consistently used to do so, much to the detriment of our understanding of what happened on that fateful day in early August 338 BC, when the Macedonian domination of all of Greece was assured. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.